very informal session. Feel free to unmute, jump in, comment, drop your thoughts whenever you want. I'm going to screen share actually, because I've just made some notes, very crappy notes, but there is a visual cue if we want to use it. So yeah, he wrote a paper called Moving Beyond Coin Voting Governance. You should go through this paper as well, actually. It's been a while since I've read it. But it's basically talking about the dangers of decentralized governance and why basically fungible coin voting has its limitations and opens itself up to governance attacks and all that sort of stuff. And he says things like using NFTs as voting, quadratic voting, non-coin governance, staking mechanics, all of these things as potential solutions. Sybil resistance tools, again, we'd done loads of it. The one after was alternatives to selling at below market clearing prices to achieve fairness in NFT launches, basically. Now, our auction.vote tech and mint.vote tech is, I think, achieves the goals of what this paper sets out to what proposes. Then he wrote a paper on the limits of crypto economics, which is a political science piece, which I haven't read yet, that one, but I've read the original paper, which is super, super interesting. And now Crypto Cities, which is basically stitches together a bunch of ideas like NFTs, city currencies, all that, and harbinger taxes, quadratic voting. Again, Vitalik and I are on a similar page when it comes to all this stuff, evidently, because we've been building it for the last year. Yeah, quadratic funding, I haven't done as much of, or haven't steered us in that direction as much. Largely because I think that's what has been done with, there's been way more quadratic funding work. There's another project called CLR.fund, which has done it. It's basically, there was no need that I saw to build any of that tech because it was kind of already done. So I would absolutely use CLR.fund to do quadratic funding. There's good tools out there already. So that's the only reason why I think it's incredibly interesting. And actually, we have done some quadratic funding on our creative content votes. So I've got a different approach to it. So the tool that we've built, and I'll jump into this in a minute, but we've done a kind of quadratic funding that's different to the quadratic funding that Vitalik's talking about. So we have, just in a roundabout way. So if you're going to record anything, just get it up and running. Grab a coffee. Everyone's just going to grab my coffee.
Oh, it's up and running.
Oh, is it good? It goes. Let me get a coffee. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Use this as a jump-off point to discuss some of the things that we've talked about. Happy all-time high day, by the way. Yeah, Ethereum's just made an all-time high. Great news. So I've just scribbled on this. But essentially, what I'll do is go through it section by section. And I won't jump out to all these links, but I recommend anyone who's ever read to dig into some of these suggestions, these links that Vitalik's sort of linked to here. So a lot of this is kind of people experimenting with sort of new city design. So I've said citadels, which is kind of what these people are going for. So some of these have made totally kind of sustainable. Well, there's no cars in this place. The whole thing's net green. I visited a place in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City that was claiming to be completely net green city, but it was kind of it was a bit of a lie, to be honest. But basically what's happening is there's people experimenting with kind of like off-grid cities. People are genuinely taking this citadel thing seriously. I know 3 people building them, either buying land on islands, buying bits of jungle, buying castles. It's happening. And basically what I just thought is that all of these places need governance, right? So they're running at this kind of utopian idea that we're going to have these essentially autonomous places outside of the nation state, or collaborating within the nation states, but almost like gated cities, almost a bit like residential places are now, but with their own governance and their own sort of value structures and all that sort of stuff. What was interesting is City DAO. So City DAO, we'll have a look at some of these links in a minute, but City DAO are a DAO that's done the Wyoming LLC thing and actually have acquired some land. and they're doing non-coin governance, which he talks about in a bit, and they're using NFTs. You buy one, you get called a citizen. So they've done basically what we've done. They've charged a lot more for them than we have, but it's actually getting involved in a DAO that's buying real world property, which is a bit of a rat's nest in all honesty, but yeah, good for them. I've contacted them already. Say, do you want some NFT governance? And then it's been an interesting trend in the last year to see non-fungible tokens and DAOs to hit the sort of market. And yeah, as you know, we are very much looking at how these two paradigms merge. We have been doing it for the last year. So the very first thing we did as a network was issue NFTs that work as decentralized governance identities or decentralized identity tokens in a DAO that also gate access to various smart contracts and stuff. So it's really nice that he's, talking about these things now, because we've been doing them for a long time and can prove it. The other things he touches on is city coins. So this has been around for a long time. I was speaking to people doing local currencies. I spoke to the people who did the Brixton pound. My first introduction to crypto after Doge tipping was a project that was doing the Liverpool pound when I lived in Liverpool. And yeah, you bought into the currency, which was a kind of stable currency. It kind of wasn't really using blockchain, to be honest, but it was a local currency idea. They did eventually, the company called Kolu, they eventually became a kind of local currency thing, and they're still going. They're now a project called Fuse. I've been speaking to them. And essentially, this has been a long dream for cryptocurrency space. The local currency, so this dream of a local currency has been around for a long time. It's one of the things that I got super, super excited about a long time ago. And, you start to imagine this localized world where local areas, local communities have their own currency. And you can do all sorts of interesting incentives with it. So the way the Liverpool pound works, and I think this is a really good idea, is that certain places around Liverpool, if you used this thing, give you a discount if you spent it with the currency. So you would buy into the currency, and then I used to get it because you'd get 15% off beer in the pubs that I used to go to. So it was like the perfect on-ramp for me because I just get cheap pints out of it. But yeah, and it made me go to the places in the app. It was like there was pubs that I didn't go to that much that I used to go to because the incentives were there. So it has the potential to build this incentive alignment, get you to use local businesses. Instead of going to the Wetherspoons, you go to these locally run pubs instead. And there was incentives for it. And weirdly, so this one, City Coins, it's built on, it goes into it in a minute, but it's built on Stacks. What's the blockchain? It's a Bitcoin thing. Can you remember what's STX? Is it STX? Blockstacks. That's it. Blockstacks. Yeah, so that's a kind of Bitcoin smart contract platform. It's a little bit weird. We'll talk about that in a minute. He talks about some projects in Seoul. The Miami have gone in on it. Basically, they've endorsed it. So the governor of Miami or whatever has said, yeah, we're into Miami coins. And you would do, because essentially it's a pre-mine cryptocurrency that they keep the pre-mine of and can essentially dump on the Miami people. It's free money, but similar principle. Yeah, Seoul are thinking of doing it. This thing in Busan, there's other places doing funding local artists. So what this is, there's like a local sculpture, or it might be the Reno one actually. There's like a local sculpture that's under threat from developers or whatever. And the local mayor is using NFTs to raise money, NFTing the sculpture to raise money to save the art. And what I thought, so what's happening here is politicians are getting into funding from NFTs and they're getting into cryptocurrencies because the incentives are there. So what's happening is the people who were previously resistant to crypto, they're almost like switching sides a little bit and going into the crypto world because it's getting them money. Basically, the incentives are there. So City DAO is building crypto-orientated cities from scratch. So this is a bit similar to the ideas. So I thought we should talk to these. I've already hassled them. But yeah, they're doing the crypto land thing, build a city on the blockchain, build it with governance, etc., etc. So that's interesting. Yeah. So Vitalik then goes, why does city governance need disrupting? And there's, he says basically these national governments start to get efficient and slow moving, and there's a big sort of concept in the organizational theory called organizational inertia. And basically what happens is, as organizations get bigger and bigger, and they always do generally if they're successful ones, then they build these processes that start to compound and get more complex. And in order for them so typically they're kind of like pyramidic structures, and we're going to be exploring with pyramids. There's a good reason why this happens, because this is how power is structured, always, generally. And these guys up here, the CEOs or the governors, whatever you want to call them, heads of the company, the higher this pyramid goes, the less visibility they have, the lower layers. So what they do is start to build reporting mechanisms that allow them to make decisions, chains of command, reporting structures, data analytics, all that sort of stuff. And basically this reporting stuff becomes more complex than the work itself that they're doing. So there's basically they're called coordination costs. And essentially this is the economic proxy to transaction costs. So if you're trying to transact good A for good C, so let's say this is like bread for shoes or something. If you've got bread, you're a baker, and you want to go to the shoemaker and get some shoes, but this guy's already got bread, you have to go through some intermediating transaction in order to get to this. This is the case for money. This is why we have money, because barter systems have never worked because of this. But essentially, when you transact into this intermediating layer, that this middleman takes costs, and this is the huge part of the justification for cryptocurrencies, because you're essentially taking the middleman out. And certainly with things like tokenization, you're going to be able to you can route through Uniswap through like 4 different coins now in one transaction. So this is one of these huge things. So blockchains have reduced transaction costs, and DAOs will reduce coordination costs. So coordination costs are like implicit to all organizations. The more complex you get, the more stuff you do, the more coordination costs you have. And essentially the stuff that I see us as building is tools that offset coordination costs in organizations, which potentially means that you don't have to be as hierarchical. Because you're using blockchains, everyone has ultimate visibility of everything. If everything that everyone in every layer does gets stored on a blockchain, then everyone can see everything, and there isn't this visibility problem. So there's huge potential that city governance, if you like, can start to use blockchains, DAOs, voting technologies to radically improve their governance dynamics. This has always been the dream. I mean, what Vitalik's talking about is exactly the problem I've been thinking about for a long bloody time. So yeah, and he kind of makes an argument here for why should we do this? It's not just because they're inefficient, but because there's utter lunatics turning up at the moment. He cites a couple of guys here that are literally talking about let's have a dictator. Let's solve these problems by, let's defeat the scourge of American leftism. Like, America's going really weird at the moment. And I thought this was just interesting to compare crypto narratives against some of the fringe discourses happening in America. And actually, when you look at what's happening in American politics right now, the conversations we're having in crypto seem a hell of a lot more sensible. So we're hitting to this moment where it's time to start rethinking city governance, public policy, local government processes, because they're all old. The way that I've done government work, I've worked for very large institutions, done work for the European Commission, the EU, And they're all the same. They all fall into this horrendously bureaucratic process. Lots of paper shuffling, where everyone's just doing all the work, shuffling the paper rather than doing the jobs that they want, or the jobs that need doing. So my absolute hatred for bureaucracy is basically set us on this path of creating these kind of DAO tools, because like Vitalik, I see this as a potential to improve things like public goods funding, urban planning, transportation, city governance, basically. What I like about this paper is Vitalik's taking it there. He's basically saying we should start thinking about how this gets into the real world now, which is interesting because like the real world is messy as hell, and people are going to run at this, and a lot of people are going to waste a lot of money. My sort of belief is that doing this in digital spaces first is more sensible. But yeah, so he kind of actually weirdly makes an argument for local government. So yeah, this idea that empowering local governments is like a big deal. I completely agree with that. It's an undervalued one. I grew up in a town where the local government was utterly awful, and I watched my hometown degrade into a post-industrial hellhole throughout my youth. It's continued its demise since. But now most of the north of England are in the same state. So the way I've always seen the route out of it is through more empowered localized governments, because it's all governance is better when it understands the local context. I don't believe in huge centralized governments because they can't possibly know what the people of these local areas all around the country actually want. So he kind of touches on smart cities. I think Ricardo's in here. Ricardo's worked on smart cities and stuff. And there's super interesting work. I've had over the years crossed paths with this. People were talking about smart cities 20 years ago when I was studying physics. And we were working on sensing technology. So I was working condensed matter science, and the tools that we were making were good at things like motion sensing, light detection, all that sort of stuff. CO2 detection talks about in here. And this is what smart cities can do. They can just collect data from how people are interacting with the city and use that as a kind of governance dynamic. But the downside is, if you're collecting data from everyone in a city, there's like huge transparency and data privacy issues. And Vitalik essentially says what we should be thinking about is how blockchain and cryptographic technologies can protect citizen agency, citizen data. I've used the word tyranny proofing here. A few of you might have noticed I got really, really upset about that WorldCoin thing. For precisely that reason. What that is a tool for absolute oppression of people by sticking them into a database and allowing them to be governed. So as bullish as I am on crypto-based governance, it's got the absolute potential to really go south on us. So I like that Vitalik's talking about the right direction in which this can go in. Then he dives into a few little city projects that are out there. So this is the whale sculpture thing. Local government selling NFTs to fund local artwork or saving the local artwork. And yeah, this is the big promise for a lot of this stuff. If it empowers local communities to collaborate, to build things and improve their local area outside, instead of waiting for some centralized governance entity. So whoever's in the federal government that's responsible for this can't have the time to care about the space whale. There's just no way that the space whale's ever going to be on an agenda anywhere in central government. So it has to be taken care of by the local people and by the local government. So Reno, pretty interesting. They're interested in about setting up a DAO, doing some DAO governance. Haven't watched this video yet, but I'm going to. And yeah, I absolutely believe there's going to be thousands of local DAOs within the next 5 years. Communities pooling money, improving the local area. Some of them will be collaborative with local government. Some of them will be outside of local government. My theory is that a local DAO I'm pretty damn sure I could set a DAO up in my hometown of Stoke-on-Trent and do better than a local government. And it wouldn't be me, it'd be the people. The people governing themselves would pass the information of what's happening on the ground, and they'd fund themselves improvements. I'm convinced it would be better than what's currently existing. And yeah, interestingly talks about things like local lotteries in here. Here's the space whale. So, local government doesn't care about the space whale, or the national government doesn't care about the space whale, but the locals do. So they're buying NFTs. I haven't looked at whether these NFTs are available on OpenSea anywhere, but I presume they've gone to the moon in the last day or two. Thanks to Vitalik. Any thoughts, comments so far? Feel free to jump in if you've got anything to say.
Well, what I thought about when I read about like city coins is, how do you create like an alternative currency if you have like a national currency as well? Like, doesn't that affect like a wider national like economic structures essentially for a city to have its own token when it's inside a country that has a currency?
Yeah, it could do. I mean, so it won't be Miami coin. So citycoins.co. It's built on stacks, Blockstacks. And its issuance is just awful. There's no way this is going to work. For one, they're issuing it to STX holders instead of people who live in Miami. So there's going to be people all over the world and it's just purely a mechanism to pump STX. Like there's absolutely not a fair launch. The issuance should be going to the local people. They're trying to on-ramp people through the Blockstacks native token into Miami coin. It's an utter mess. So the US dollar has nothing to worry about for Miami coin, that's for sure. All that's going to happen is the SDX holders are going to dump on the people of Miami. But the concept itself is very interesting. So yeah, if you imagine all the economic bandwidth starts flowing through London coin, for example, like if London released, like if I basically said, right, London coin, and launched London coin using auction.vote tomorrow, somehow did a fair launch, thinking about it, could probably you can have an NFT gated auction to the people of London, and we start using London coin local venues, I'd be in the back of a van within a week. I'm pretty damn sure. It is a massive, it is a threat to local power, to currency structures. It has to be. But is there anything they can do to stop it? I don't know. Yeah. And so what was interesting about the Miami coin thing is that it's actually endorsed by the local government. They've got an allocation on it. So if it becomes a new revenue generation, so if like Sadiq Khan here as London mayor managed to get another like 100 million quid out of launching a local currency coin that incentivized people to use non-chain places, and and this is the kind of dream of these things. There's the Brixton Pound guys here essentially created this local produce, local consumer circle where people get discounts if they pay in it. It all gets settled back to pounds eventually, So it doesn't necessarily threaten the pound in any way. If anything, it incentivizes. So if you think about where the money's spent, so if I go down to the corner down here in London, go to a Pret, I suspect a huge amount of their revenues getting offshored somewhere because it's a big multinational company. If I go to Starbucks, how much of that economic value is going into London? Probably not much. It's all going into Starbucks' central accounting system, which is probably based in the Cayman Islands. So there's a huge potential for local currencies to actually rebuild the high street, because the high streets are dead at the moment. So there's huge potential for these things. So I'll circle back on some of these things. So there's like local currencies, and I think on this I write a note somewhere that they need to be fair launched, and they need to be localized, which means a kind of civil resistance type approach. Because if some crypto whale from China or something buys up 50% of the token supply, that's going to ruin the local economy. And because that whale's just going to relentlessly dump on the locals until the whatever value comes into the economy just gets wrecked by the whales. So it needs to be a fair launch distribution. This city DAO is interesting. They've done the Wyoming DAO law thing. I'm scared of lawyers. I don't like them. I don't trust them. I would not put our DAO into some legal wrapper. I read it all. I read the Wyoming DAO LLC. You have to basically backdoor your contracts to allow Wyoming to rug the DAO if you want to do this. Like, they want to be able to stop it. And in which case, what's the point in being a DAO? You might as well just be an LLC. I don't understand the kind of purpose of it, really. Well, these guys are exploring it. I'm very skeptical of it, but what they're doing is crowdfunding with NFTs, selling these things. NFTs, we use the term citizens for our local NFTs as well. And yeah, interesting. These are like 10 ETH each or something, or some of them are at least anyway. You can be a founder member. I'll try and persuade them to use our NFT voting tools, because I know for a fact with people who've done more work on that than anyone else, they might want to build it themselves. I don't know. So yeah, you can see their governance is a voting scheme based on citizen NFTs. So, and they're using harbinger taxes. I don't know how, but we've also built our yield mechanism that runs on harbinger taxes. So what do I think these cities could do? He's saying the two distinct categories that makes blockchains make sense: more trusted, transparent, verifiable versions of existing processes. All of our tools on influence, you would have a complete, transparent and obvious chain of decision making. So I've worked in very large organizations, and then the amount of times I would hit something and said, who come up with this idea? Like, whose bloody idea was this to do this bloody thing that I'm doing today? Just fuming about it because I'm wasting my time doing some bullshit that used to wind me up. And there's no way to know. The decision was made probably years ago. We just do it now. It's just something we do. It's happened. Let's all deal with it. Because the act of changing it or unwinding it would take 2 years' work. So people just do the things that you don't know why that decision was made or who made that decision. Doesn't matter how bad it was, it's gone now. That's like, we just do it. So this kind of true provenance of decision making that you can get with blockchains. Why did we make that decision? When was it made? What was the justification for it? If all that is recorded and you can search it in a second on a database, then you can say, oh, actually, the reason why we made that decision 2 years ago was because of something that's not the case anymore. So, which is normally what happens. The context changes. The decision to do that thing at that time made sense, but doesn't anymore. So with blockchains, you'll be able to see the full history of decision making over time. And the other thing is new experimental forms of ownership. This is what we're doing with yield.vote. So this is what we're doing with influence.vote. And ultimately what there's two subsequent apps, Proposal and Decision, which kind of complete the stack, which we'll be working on over the next year. And yeah, new experimental forms of democratic governance, which is also this. So, I mean, this is kind of, this first one's basically what blockchains do. Ethereum takes care of this. And then the second bit is what I think some of our DAO tools are doing. So yeah, it kind of goes into some of the existing processes. What was he going on about here? So he makes the kind of argument that actually local governments should adopt blockchain technology and build a kind of private currency out of it. So certainly in massive places like America, there's huge amounts of money flows around internally to the government organization. They just move like billions around. And yeah, I'm like, I don't know how they use their internal payment rails at the moment, but I used to work for the National Health Service in the accounts department years ago, in my kind of summers between studying. And I've seen the kind of remittance processes internally to large organizations, and it's an absolute shit show. Still the same, paper-based invoicing themselves between departments, just utterly crazy. So this is a good idea. You know, it's basically talking about transparency on tax revenue. But if you could actually see where all your tax money went, you'd either everyone would pay it or everyone would stop paying it, depending on how well it's spent. And I suspect if they actually knew how well tax money was spent, no one would pay it. But yeah, so then we've got, then he talks about lotteries. I've been interested in kind of lottery stuff. I'm not a gambler, but lotteries as a kind of fair distribution mechanism they are an interesting source of, if you're going to get your citizens gambling, you might as well get the citizens gambling in a way that benefits the nation, if you like. But what I'm really interested in is sortition, which is how you select people's decisions So the Athenian democracy from like 2000 years ago was run on sortition. And essentially what would happen is every citizen would be in a record in a sort of database, early database of sorts. And they would just pull your name out of a hat and you were in the government that year, whether you were a farmer or a shoemaker or gentry, whatever the kind of different tiers of society, you were essentially in power the next year. And it creates a kind of radical fair approach to decision making, because there's no way that this kind of aristocratic layer ignores the base layer if the base layer are in the government themselves. But you need kind of random selection. Funny enough, the first thing that UV and I built a prototype for influence about 3 years ago, and it was a sortition based thing for doing a kind of Reddit like comment sorting thing, where prizes, essentially people's top comments would be selected by sortition, and there would be sort of a random lottery type system built in it as well. I think we'll revisit some of those mechanics at some point. Certification, I advised a blockchain project for university certificates years ago. So you could essentially try and convince universities to issue cryptographic proofs that you actually completed that degree. It's going to happen eventually. It's just way too early to flip institutions into it a long time ago. And asset registries. Our yield contract is essentially like a land registry. It keeps track of 50 squares of land, digital land. Who's in slot 35 at the moment is paying X tax that they decide the value of to what they're willing to hold it for, and they protocol revenue for that. Now, these taxes we collect as LP tokens. So we're doing the protocol owned liquidity thing that Olympus DAO are doing, but they just take all of them, which is crazy. I can't believe they've managed to convince people to give them their entire LP tokens, all their LP tokens for more shitcoins. It's crazy. But what we do is offer people the option to pick a percentage tax that they're willing to pay. It could give them all up if they wanted the tokens enough, but that would be dependent on the demand for the tokens at that time. So this is the harbinger taxes thing. So one of the things we're interested in doing is applying a kind of digital land thing to this. So you'll note yield product has like little houses. We call it protocol properties. The reason why we were interested in that, the digital land stuff. So I don't know Decentraland's done really well. I annoyingly sold my mana tokens not long ago, just before this point. So annoyed about it. But the reason why I thought Decentraland would never work is because right in the very early days in 2017, some whales just bought up 90% of the map. And it costs like more than a New York City apartment to buy like a parcel of digital land. I just don't see it working, frankly. So what you need is something like harbinger taxes, which stops, like if you look at the Decentraland map, there's like huge blocks of it like this that have been bought up. There's like a huge chunk of it that's like for the red light district. And no one's built anything on it yet. Whoever bought that is just hoarding the land. And ideally, you'd want the new cool NFT metaverse galleries or whatever to be able to buy that land off this guy who's doing nothing with it. And we kind of think yield.vote will work for that eventually. Yeah, so I kind of disagreed with Vitalik here. So he thinks that if humanity's ever going to move to electronic government, local government is the first place to start. I disagree. I think digital governments are the first place to start. You're never going to get local governments to do this stuff. I've worked with them. They barely use email. Getting them to onboard to Web3 will happen somewhere around 2040. So what I think is that we just build our own digital worlds and govern them like they're real worlds. And, we'll be able to do radical economics in the metaverse because we're playing with digital land and digital art and digital assets. So yeah, he's kind of said, what we should be playing with is a better version of city tokens. This has made me want to reach out to some of the local currency people again. But I don't think this stacks thing will work. It needs to be fair launched. It certainly can't be issued via STX holders. To really do it, you'd want to flow the tokens to the actual local people. You'd need fiat on ramps. But this idea that you can invest in a local currency. And so you basically, you get the local people to buy this local currency, govern how it's spent, whatever local pot of money is raised is spent. The value of the token goes up as the city prospers, which could be super, super interesting. But yeah, he's talking about this could be new mechanisms for sources of revenue for the government. And this issue around economic alignment between residents and the city is absolutely huge. Incentive alignment is what tokens can do. It creates win-win, non-zero sum games, and it will create a kind of empathy and a connection between local government and stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's so much of this that we're doing. I've been thinking about these things for a long time. It's great to see Vitalik articulate them in this way. Yeah, I don't know what people's thoughts are. Anyone else have any reflections, thoughts on the essay?
Hi, Nick. Ricardo here.
Hey, Ricardo.
So yeah, thanks for going over this. Really interesting. I've been taking some notes here as you were speaking, and there's so many things that we could discuss related to this. My perspective is from a political science or policy background, but so I wanted to. I think it might be interesting to mention a couple of things. There's one project that I'm familiar with. It's called Colu.com, COLU.com.
Yeah, who I was mentioning, who did the Liverpool Pound project.
Oh, right.
I've spoken to.
It's pretty interesting. Yeah, they're doing some interesting stuff.
Protocol called Fuse now, Fuse.io.
All right.
Yeah, I bought into the Colu ICO in like 2016, 2017. They ended up
really?
They ended up giving the money back to everyone. It was they decided not to do the token in the end, but they're now a project called Fuse, which does have a currency. They've got their own blockchain. It's like a side chain to Ethereum, and they've got these white label. It's like a white label wallet system. So they built the nice infrastructure for spinning up local currencies. It's basically ERC-720s, ERC-20s on a side chain, but they've got these kind of like it's a white label wallet system. So they build you a coin and a wallet, and then you can brand it for your local area, and you can spin up a local currency in a day or whatever. And they've had them used as currencies for like music festivals, stuff like that. I should reach back out to them again. We were going to do a partnership last year and we never closed it off. But yeah, I love that project and I think it's really interesting. Like I say, I've believed in the local currency vision for a long time. It's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so there's a couple other things from the poli-sci perspective that might be interested discussing, but it might take too long here. So I'm not sure if this is the right time. I might just make a couple posts.
I'm happy to stick on till about past, let's say. But I'm keen to get into some poli-sci conversation if you're up for it. But yeah, maybe let's leave the kind of theoretical political science for after the hour.
Okay.
Unless if anyone's got any other points, but yeah, let's see if there's any other questions. Then we'll come back to that because I'm interested in doing it. Is there any other thoughts or comments on this paper? Anyone make any connections with what we're doing? I missed this final section actually, which is this kind of stuff around pro-social activity. There is, if you imagine local DAOs and people pooling money, getting some tokens back for it, which gives them votes, and they decide how the money's spent, it creates a kind of civic mindedness around, I'm convinced it would make people in a community communicate in ways that they haven't done before. So it's been a huge dream of mine to set up Stoke DAO, where I'm from, give them a bunch of money and just say, spend it on whatever you want. We're actually doing this with Tribes DAO, where the dog coin is going to have a pot of money they can spend it on whatever they want. In fact, they've got to collaborate across the tribes. Same idea. But I do think it will create, when we've got a shared goal, it will create more pro-social activity. And yeah, the kind of the other thing he's talking about, more radical and participatory forms of governance. All of this stuff is everything that we're interested in. Quadratic voting, quadratic funding, and this is influence, and this is yield.vote. And essentially you can imagine people owning digital land and the fees being collected as a kind of way to subsidize local businesses and stuff. Imagine a kind of digital version of your local town that people can buy NFTs in, and the digital land gets a kind of metaverse thing, and the fees that are generated by it actually go into the real world to subsidize local businesses.
There's one thing I'm interested in, and I think we've spoken
Yeah.
about it before, Nick, and I suppose I still haven't quite got my head around it yet. And that
Yeah.
is, how do Harburger taxes and individual property rights work together?
Yes, they don't. This is the kind of payoff. This is why it won't happen in the real world, because, and not for a long time anyway, and not without evidence that it works better. So you essentially got this private property paradigm, which is, unless you're in even places like China, state-owned land places. I think Singapore have a kind of interesting, Ricardo might be able to help me on this, but there's places where the nation state essentially was, I mean, it happens here. The Queen essentially owns the land of London for a lot of it. These kind of freehold ideas. But ultimately, private property is that you can't take this from me once I bought it. Under no circumstances, not for generations. And Harburger taxes, because your property is always on sale, it moves to this partial common ownership idea, where you have to conceptualize land and property as, instead of being a private enterprise, as a commons. And we're all just renting it from the earth instead of it's mine forever.
Yeah, I wanted to make a kind of a joke comment, but property is theft, Matt.
Property what?
Property is theft.
Property sept.
Theft.
Property is
Property
theft.
theft. Yes.
No, property is theft. This is what I want.
Property is theft.
You don't know this expression?
I feel like I've talked to an
It's-
analyst that's told that.
Yeah. I'm jokingly using it, but I think I think the problem between like ANCAPs and left-wing anarchists is that they just misinterpreted this. I mean, property could be commons, right? And then everyone's happy. So.
Yeah, and I mean, the kind of libertarian idea, libertarians take this. So a lot of libertarian school of thinking comes from like John Locke and the kind of early political philosophy around minimization of the state, that basically everyone's, the whole purpose of the state is just to do the absolute minimal amount, just enough to protect people from everything turning into law of the jungle. And libertarians take this to an absolute extreme point of view, where they're like, give me my private property and give me my guns and I'll defend it myself. Like, I don't need infrastructure. I don't need local services. That's all socialist craziness. Like, I don't need roads. I don't need libraries. I don't need local schools. Leave me to myself. And then there's this a much more communitarian sort of dynamic of it, which is actually, let's all pool our money together and decide how it's spent, which is much closer to this Harburger taxes idea. Whereas socialism is like a step further, which is, I'm going to take my money off you and then we'll decide how it's spent, where we is the government. And that's where a lot of socialist and certainly communist ideas fall down, is that they believe that everything can be centrally managed, which is impossible for all the reasons we talked about earlier. And this is a kind of hybrid idea where, I mean, it's a very capitalist idea, actually, when you get down to it. The examples are, let's say Elon Musk wants to build a Hyperloop in Manhattan. With Harburger taxes, he'd be able to buy an entire block, kick everyone out in 6 months and build his Hyperloop. And the idea is that Elon should be allowed to do that because we get a Hyperloop out of it. So people are buying this stuff to improve the area, if you like. But it also stops land hoarding. So you've got like people who just sit on land for generations and just earn money off it. And that's kind of, which is the downside of this. Eventually you run out of land. There's not an infinite amount of land, and the John Locke philosophy falls over, because all of that is predicated on the idea that we're never going to run out of land, but we will. So you kind of need something else to broker property arrangements eventually.
Of like governance.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, actually maybe there's an interesting thing with the community there, where we could have like essentially a lottery within the community, and if you're selected, you go into, like, I can't think of the word, they normally have it with governments, so you'd have like a section of the community that would basically learn about a topic and then kind of have to make recommendations based off that. Do you know the word I'm searching for? I can't think of what it's called.
You think of the topic to do. Say the example again.
So what you'd have, just like within the FTV world, you'd have like a section of the community that would be chosen at random, and essentially they would go on to, like, let's call it a council, quote unquote. Essentially, we would then go through a process of sort of communication, education, knowledge sharing, and then we would kind of have like this, it's almost like joint decision making, but kind of community driven insights on what they've learned about what we're doing and how things could, like, what direction those things could move in. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've thought about this in the past, and I'd be very open to it. Some of this will become clear on Thursday when I go through the governance framework, which actually has this kind of, we're going to use a pyramid structure. This is kind of sacrilege in DAO world, right? Because we're meant to be getting rid of the hierarchies. But there's always a power structure, right? There's no two ways about it. It's obvious that myself and you, Matt, and some of the other DAO leaders have more control over the network than other people. Saying that we don't is a lie. And it's just, at best, burying our heads in the sand. And there's this idea called the tyranny of structurelessness, which is if there is no structure, then the power relationships that are unarticulated take over. And this is why, like, communes and all these places always end up in, like, Lord of the Flies territory, because normally there's some really bossy, boisterous person that ends up taking over. But we're a flat, there's no hierarchy, there's no one in control, but there actually is. So my thinking is that we are going to end up with these tiered power structures. And there's ultimately this kind of DAO leader territory, and this peak in the pyramid is called Senate, which is intended to fly off at some point. It's like we're going to remove the centralizing elements of the DAO as a kind of like send off in the third phase of the network. But if we wanted to keep this around, then what you could do is appoint people to the Senate via sortition, and you're just kind of, your NFT would be drawn out of a hat, and all of a sudden you're in control along with the rest of the Senate leaders for a period of time. I'd be very open to trying something like that. At the very least, we can experiment with different forms of feedback. So that this whole section here, more democratic feedback. So this is exactly why we build influence.vote as a signaling tool. Use quadratic voting to determine what people want and care about and why they want and care about it, and close a feedback loop between the power structures and from here to here. And yeah, if you could imagine a digital democracy where, once a month, the government asked you what you cared about and why, and that was actually integrated into the social policy, that would demonstrably be better. That would be obviously better than the disconnect that we have now, where we've just got these kind of like puppet show politicians just bumbling around and doing stuff, and we have no say over it for 4 years at a time. Interestingly, the sortition thing, there's a really great book called Against Elections, which I recommend, which is all about sortition. And it basically makes the argument that elections are the problem. So we've certainly fallen to this in the last several years, where everyone's on the campaign trail all the time. We don't actually do any policy decision making that has any long-term thinking, because all anyone's ever doing is trying to win the next election, and everything's just PR and fluff to convince people to vote for them. So what you should do is have a more sortition-based democracy, where people get selected from citizenry to join citizens' assemblies. It's one of the ideas that's used heavily in that, which is like, let's all talk about this. This is a major local issue. Let's have a kind of focus group on it. And Ireland actually does quite a lot of this.
Citizens Assembly. Couldn't think of
Citizens
words.
Assembly.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm totally getting. We actually spoke to. When we did our London Mayor experiment, there's a local party called Burning Pink, who said they wanted to get rid of the local mayor. Like their campaign thing was, we're going to remove the role of mayor completely and replace it with citizens' assemblies. And I tried to get them to use influence. And I spoke to the woman for a bit who's like leading it, and they had this kind of really radical view of like, she wanted to go back to the community to ask if they'd do it, and then she got arrested for throwing pink paint at the Guardian headquarters. So yeah, quite interesting stuff. But yeah, so this stuff around regulations and permits and all that sort of stuff, and closing the gap with a little of this. This is a vision of the world, Vitalik says, where everyone uses quadratic voting to set subsidies and prices for everything. So yeah, I mean, totally on board with all of this. I've obviously enjoyed this piece because it completely validates what we're working on here. So yeah, any other thoughts, comments? People are still hanging around. I know we're running over the hour.
We could have the conversation asynchronously as well, because it seems like, I mean, it's wonderful. I can just have this conversation all day.
Yeah, I'll happily stick around for another 20 minutes or so. Ricardo, you wanted to dive into some political science ideas?
Well, not really here. It's just a couple of concerns. I think the first tweet my first exchange with you on Twitter was about an impression that I had since I started in crypto 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And that is how limited knowledge and understanding of power and politics and policy blockchain luminaries have in general. Yeah, and I guess I can say in general, and this is scary.
Yeah, it is.
And this is one of the reasons why I really liked what you were saying, what you're doing, and then I started reading about FET and etc. And that's how I got interested in it, because you actually had a good argumentation about this.
So there's a reason why. So I agree with you. It is a bit scary. Now, I was a physicist by background, so I had no idea of anything to do with the concepts of power, sociological concepts, if you like. But I eventually moved from being a physicist to a social scientist, focusing on education and learning theory and organizational dynamics and so on, and had to learn all this stuff. And what I realized was my perception of the world changed radically. And, in research sort of methodological terms, they call it an epistemology, your lens on reality. Like, everyone sees a different reality, and how you view the world can shift over time. And mine did. I went from being a scientist, with what we call a logical positivist, into something that's much more, I would sort of call it much more like a critical realist or pluralist idea. And yeah, it's quite common that technologists don't have any concept of this stuff because they're not trained in these ideas.
Yes, exactly.
Too much STEM in blockchain. Actually pointed it out in this Twitter conversation, right?
Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your username, Xenia. I guess this is exactly what I mean. So this is the first time I realized. I've been following Vlad for quite a while, and when he started posting about governance, etc., and realizing that things are more complicated than they seem, and the fact that you can improve a process does not mean that you should improve a process, because there are unintended consequences in terms of power, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like I so much relate to what you're saying. It's crazy. Like, I just want to run to all these people and say, go, I don't know, get like a cheap course in sociology, and that will help, because you're just trying to solve everything with, yeah.
I mean, Vlad posted something that there was someone going to say, what Web 1 was this, Web 2 was this, Web 3 is this. And it was like, you get to own your own part of the internet or something like that. And someone said, what's Web 4? And Vlad Zamfir jumped in and said, the internet owns you. and he's seen something about where this goes.
Ooh, yeah. Interesting.
Like he's somewhere about 3 or 4 years ago, he like just hates everything to do with anything now, and like I think he's seen the kind of some of the dystopian outcomes of this. So like you, Father, I'm worried that people will kind of clumsily, like, this is why I hate that WorldCoin thing. The technologists will clumsily install dystopia in an effort to pump their bags. You know? So yeah, I think here's my thinking on this is that we can teach people the notion of power through DAOs and through using these. So I think people can be trained in understanding these things purely out of a desire to earn tokens and earn money, maximize their investments. So yeah, I think there's a lot of what we're doing is kind of this merger of technology and social dynamics. As you get to the social layer, and DAOs in particular, this is where humans plug into blockchains. That's where it gets interesting and also scary. Cool. Any other comments, thoughts? I'll happily hang around for a little bit longer. People are interested in exploring these ideas a little bit more.
Obviously, like you don't like lawyers, right? And for good reason. And the DAO legal wrapper in Wyoming just seems like, what's the word, fool's gold, maybe, something like that. But I suppose there will at some point need to be some bridge between digital world and the real world, right? Like, IRL per se.
Yeah.
What would be for you, what would you feel comfortable seeing and doing? Like, what would look attractive?
Yeah, it could have been the Wyoming thing, to be quite honest. And it may have been amended. I mean, what you're essentially doing is you're jurisdictionalizing yourself as a DAO if you choose one of these legal wrappers. So there is eventually going to be this merger from DAOs with the real world. I conceptualize, have done for a long time, there's like two planes of reality, digital world and the real world. And the two are rather divorced, like the parallel planes of reality. And one of the things that you can potentially tether between the two worlds with legal wrappers, legal constructs. One of the ways I thought this might be possible is with security tokens. So you're essentially saying, okay, this essentially tokenizes some real world business or some real world enterprise. And, I would be interested in using the affordances of blockchain technology so let's say, for example, we as a DAO decide to set up a real world company somewhere that's an operational company that takes FET tech into organizations in the real world. So we say, right, as a community, we want organizations, conventional organizations, like I wanted to get universities to use this tech eventually. And we want to earn money, like real capital, for just like installing the technology into organizations. I would be very up for a security token that captured the revenue like a share would in a real world company. And I think that's the kind of easiest, that's the first step in for me, a token that represents shared ownership in a company, in an actual IRL entity. That seems safer to me than a DAO wrapper where you're essentially jurisdictionalizing the DAO, and the DAO needs to comply to local laws, tax laws in that country. No, I'm not American. I don't know how many Americans we have in the group. We've never marketed to Americans. We're a global entity as far as I'm concerned. We've got, members from the Philippines, from Vietnam, Japan, UK, Berlin, like Germany, all over Europe. So it doesn't make sense to me to jurisdictionalize the DAO to America because we're not American, and DAOs aren't our nation-specific entity as far as I'm concerned. They're global digital organizations. So now, if we were all American, or 90% American, or 70% American, and we wanted to own some land in America, like that City DAO, then maybe I'd consider it doing the Wyoming LLC thing. But given that we're experimenting with bits of DeFi, decentralized governance, that all of a sudden the American government can say, that's illegal now. Well, in fact, you are now a criminal, Nick. That could happen tomorrow. And it means that they could say, shut down that company, and therefore shut down the DAO. And that wrapper gives them the power to do that. So it doesn't feel censorship resistant to me. It feels like an existential threat to the DAO that I wouldn't want to introduce at this point in time. I absolutely expect there are going to be legal wrappers for DAOs. There's other people talking about, there's foundation-like structures. There's other people playing with different legal forms that might work, but they're very, very early, and legal structures move glacially compared to what happens in crypto. So I honestly think it'll be 10 or 15 years away before, the tethering between the digital world and the real world is a good idea to do. And yeah, it's a bit of a mess, to be quite honest. And which is why I'm super interested in just staying purely digital. What we're building is digital worlds, digital assets. We exist entirely in the digital layer. We live in the metaverse. And then everyone's fundamentally responsible for dealing with their own tokens in their own way. Everyone gets some tokens for participating, and the jurisdictional nature of that is determined by where you as an individual DAO member live, as opposed to the DAO living somewhere. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does actually. And I was just thinking, so when you say like tokenization of, say, a real world asset or business, I'm thinking, have you seen, it's called Masterworks. Have you heard of them? They do the tokenization of art.
I might have done, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, so they tokenize like physical art, and then you can buy, X amount of Banksy or something.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously completely different from what you're talking about, but in theory, it's the same sort of, structure of like tokenization of an asset, right?
It is. And I'm glad you brought that up. So that is another, so what you can do, so setting up an LLC. So this is when legal wrappers become very interesting, because let's say there's an issue called the Oracle problem, which is a big one. So let's say you've got, and it's again between this tethering between the digital world and the real world. Let's say I convince an artist in London to make a series of 10 paintings, famous artists, everyone wants them, and I sell them using auction.vote, one-to-one auctions. We raise, people are buying them for $1 million each. And then the artist decides to not send the paintings to the people, right? So we have a digital version and a real world version. And the Oracle problem is when you say this NFT represents this painting, and it doesn't represent the painting. There's a disconnect between the painting can be destroyed in a fire, and the token still exists. And that's kind of what's known as the Oracle problem, whereas there's like the difficulty of representing the real world into the digital world is very, very difficult. Now, one of the routes around this is if you apply a legal wrapper to the digital asset itself, which says if the artist doesn't send them, that you can sue them. Right? Here's his name and address. This is where he lives. He has promised to honor this token for this painting. And if he doesn't deliver it, then you've got legal recourse in the real world for it. That I think is very interesting. And in fact, there are companies I've spoke to them in the past. There's where you can, using the Ethereum blockchain, we've done this in the past, spin up an LLC that is owned by a private key and creates a legal wrapper around an address. And that, I think, could be very interesting. Now, what you could do is set up 10 LLCs for the 10 paintings, and each painting has its own company, essentially. Yeah.
I have a quick question, but from what I understand, my limited understanding yet, a legal wrapper would always be related to a jurisdiction, right?
Correct.
So this is where this is why you're saying that it actually will probably take a long time.
Yeah, because it jurisdictionalizes that. Now, it might be the case that, so yeah, now that's an LLC is no good if I'm trying to sell, if I'm trying to create a essentially securitizing the NFT for these paintings, creating a Delaware LLC or something for that is no good here in the UK, because the artist is UK resident, and that jurisdictional issue is, there's like an international tapestry of law which is insanely complex. Like every jurisdiction has its own rules and regulations, and yeah, that's a huge problem. And that's why I think it's 10-15 years away, because what there is actually need for is international collaboration across these geopolitical entities to agree on a legal framework that allows
And
digital.
it's a nightmare.
Oh, it's like we know how little countries collaborate. If anything, we're collaborating less and less. Like we've just fallen out with the EU. Like everyone's falling out with one another. I just don't see it happening anytime soon. But what you can do, there is companies that use a kind of legal custodian thing, where what you can do is get the artist before the NFTs are issued to deliver the paintings into a company which takes temporary ownership of them and becomes the custodian of them, earns some fees, and that's the way it's settled, via a kind of intermediary, which is how I would do it and might do it. We are thinking about physical settlement. So we've got this auction system for selling high value NFTs. One of the other papers that Vitalik released is selling NFTs below market rate, and the way you get around that is from auction designs. Instead of the auction happening on the protocol level, it should happen in a price discovery process at the time of minting or at the time of sale. So if we've got a kind of decentralized auction system where an NFT can equal a piece of fine art, then the way in which you would do that for me is actually have a physical company in the real world that holds the art, and then if people cash in the NFT, they get it sent to their front door. So custodians are another route into the kind of tokenization piece. But again, that's like an abstraction away from the company, the DAO. DAOs, no one knows what a DAO is. I was speaking to some lawyers a couple of weeks ago, so it was like they were picking my brains rather worryingly. And they were basically, they were saying a DAO is like this. I'm saying, no, it's not. What a DAO is not settled yet. There is no definition for one. And that's a precursor for any kind of legal wrapper to exist. You can't create a legal wrapper when we don't know what a DAO is yet. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I think we've got a long way to go before we even define what a DAO is. Now, we've invented 5 types of DAO pattern so we're defining what a DAO is at the moment, but so it's certainly not settled. It's not an idea that's formed yet. So yeah, my instinct is to stay purely in the digital world. Let other people like City DAO own land, blaze the trail. You're going to need millions in legal fees. I know people who went to do an ICO in 2017 still haven't done it to this day because they were trying to be legally compliant with it and spend $1.2 million on lawyers, because there is no way to be legally compliant because no one knows what the definitions of these systems are yet, and they can change their mind at any minute. So yeah, it's kind of that whole real world crossover mess is a bit of a nightmare. It's a bit of a rat's nest, to be honest. Yeah, and part of me thinks is like, does the person in Reno know what they're getting into? Does the I think the governor of Miami or whatever is just a bit of a mad lad. It's just, I mean, and this is what we need, is people that just blaze the trail, right? So yeah, I think there's varying levels of risk, right? So there's one of the things we do as a DAO framework is, so we're talking to influencers and football teams and people who are interested in launching NFTs and DAOs and all this sort of stuff. And some are frankly scared of getting involved in setting up a DAO because of the because of the sort of legal greyness of it all. And there's ways to edge into it. You know, you can, I would say that the kind of riskiest is launching a fungible cryptocurrency, retaining a reserve amount of it. And because that, you know, they could decide, the SEC could decide that anyone who's done that has launched an illegal security. And they could do that with NFTs. They could do that. Anyone who's launched a digital asset, that tomorrow they could say, and you know, this particularly when you're talking to influencers who've got like, you know, 2 million followers or something like that, who all they need to say is buy my shitcoin, and they can get a $250 million market cap in 24 hours, you know, which happened last week, and someone rugged it. It is risky, and people shouldn't be doing it unless they understand the risks and are doing it in a way that is, so that the Anubis rug that happened last week was just carelessness. It was a project that was a dog Ponzi scheme. The product description was bark, bark, bark. And people put 14,000 Ether into it. And whoever held the keys was sitting on $60 million and ran off with it. I mean, just absolute carelessness. So yeah, people should be concerned about it. And the regulations are miles away from being able to, like, I'm just imagining some guys sat at the SEC thinking, how do we regulate this dog Ponzi that's just come out? Like, it's easier for them to just say, no one can do it. So there's ways in which you can go in without doing the fungible tokens. So for example, this is why I think NFTs have done so well this year. As the legal concerns get more and more, you have purchased this digital art for digital money with digital money, like funny money for art. It's very difficult to say that that is an illegal security, and especially if everyone who bought it has the expectation that it was just a piece of art. Like, I bought a piece of art, that's it. So this is one of the major reasons why we're very interested in launching NFTs and NFT DAOs, because, you know, people with large followings can sell digital art pieces to their followers and build a new communication route with them. And that's the regulatory sort of distance, or the regulatory fears of that are far less than, you know, launching a cryptocurrency and making a market with it and so on. So we sort of dived into kind of like regulatory concern. I think it will get to this. I think the cities thing, this is where it all changes, I think. If you've got, you know, mayors of local towns, like in America, if and it could happen as things get, you know, dicey over the next couple of years, because government revenue is low. There's only so much money printing you can do before it becomes a very, very bad idea. And, you know, the American government spent $9 trillion last year. And the way that they're going to taper this off is by giving less money to, you know, the revenue is going to dry up. So when someone comes to a local government and says, why don't you launch cryptocurrency? You can actually do all the things that you want. And there's someone with a 4-year term there thinking, yeah, why not? I think it could happen. You know? So yeah, super glad that Vitalik's pushing the envelope on this. I'm slightly resistant personally about getting too into the real world stuff for the things I've just said, but yeah, interesting. Any other final thoughts? I have some token economic spreadsheets to do, so I'm going to jump off in 5-10 minutes, but happily I'll answer another couple of questions if anyone's got any. Drop a question in the chat if you want. Lovely number of people. There's a lot of accounts here I've not recognized before. If you're new to the DAO, welcome. We do this several times a week. We've got a program. I'm talking about bank.vote tomorrow. Oh no, Thursday. We've got IRL meetings tomorrow. But on Thursday, I'm going through and the release of our DAO Suite application, bank.vote, which is a payroll investing system. It's one of the things that provides rug proofing for these projects.